We're just going to give a couple of more minutes to wait until other attendees join before we kick off this conversation. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're joining us from around the world today. Welcome to the Arab News Research and Studies Briefing Room webinar titled, What Does the Future Hold for NATO and the Mena Region? In partnership with the Middle East Institute's Frontier European Initiative. Now, today's conversation revolves around one of the research unit's briefing reports of the same title, written by Luke Coffey, the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Now, for those of you who haven't had the chance to read the report or would be interested in reading it after this conversation, do click on the link below in the chat box where you'll find the link. Now, joining alongside Luke is Dr. Yulia Joja, a senior fellow of the Frontier Europe Initiative and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Now, we're aiming to have a 30-minute conversation with our guests, and we'll allocate a further 15 to 20 minutes afterwards for your questions. So please do use the Q&A function found on your screens below to submit your questions. Now, we hope to be able to answer all of your questions, but given the time constraints, we really can't guarantee that all of them will be able to go through. And now, without further ado, I would really love to kick off this exciting conversation with Luke. Would you please be able to briefly summarize the report that you've written for us?
Absolutely. Greetings to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. As Tariq said, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I first want to thank Tariq for putting this together and just say quickly that the Arab News Research and Studies Center and also the Middle East Institute's Frontier Europe Center or Initiative has some fantastic stuff on their websites in terms of how, well, with the Middle East Institute, how the Middle East and Europe sort of converge on geopolitical issues. It's fascinating stuff. So I recommend you check out both of their sites. And also I want to thank both of them for cooperating to put this together today. So I'll speak briefly about the paper that I wrote, which Tariq has placed in the chat of this Zoom call. The focus of the paper was NATO needing a strategy for the Middle East North African region. Now, in recent years, there's been a major debate among policymakers in both North America and Europe about what the future of NATO is and where NATO should be active. And this is actually nothing new. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, NATO has gone through many such debates about what its purpose is. There's been talk about focusing NATO on counterterrorism. There's been a debate about, well, now we need to worry about China. There's been a debate about, well, Russia remains the big threat. I myself personally am more of a traditionalist on this. I do believe that NATO was created and designed to, when necessary, defeat Russia and during the meantime, deter it from aggression. However, I do also understand that there are other challenges that the alliance must deal with. Sometimes the alliance deals with these challenges collectively as an institution. Other times, the members of the alliance, individual members, will take the initiative and lead on a particular issue or a particular initiative. Now, one of the reasons why I say that Russia should remain NATO's main focus is because in Article 6 of the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty, it says that where Article 5 applies, and remember, Article 5 is the security guarantee, Article 6 says that Article 5 will apply in the North Atlantic region, north of the Tropic of Cancer. So this is NATO's area of responsibility. So if you look at a map, while not entirely part of NATO's area of responsibility as defined by Article 6, the Middle East and North Africa region is, a good chunk of it is in this area of responsibility and is in this region. And what European and American policymakers, I think, understand is that many of the challenges and also opportunities that can be found in Middle East and North Africa can sometimes spill over into Europe. So that's why NATO needs to maintain an interest in the MENA region. I should stress up front, this isn't about looking for, a solution, looking for a problem. This isn't about, NATO trying to plan its next military intervention anywhere. This is about identifying a key region to NATO's stability and security, and then finding willing and like-minded partners that are willing to cooperate and work together to achieve common goals and common results. As NATO goes through this process of deepening its relationships with certain countries in North Africa and the Middle East, it must be mindful of sensitivities, and it should only go at the pace, at the speed at which the particular country desires to. So, for example, NATO shouldn't be pushing, pushing Tunisia to open up a NATO military base if Tunisia doesn't want to, for example. If all Tunisia wants to do is allow a few NATO officers to come in and observe a military exercise, then NATO should find a way to get as much benefit from that limited activity as possible without overly pushing or being pushy on deepening any sort of relationship. And the truth is, different countries in the North Africa and Middle East regions have different levels of enthusiasm to cooperate with NATO. Let's be honest, many of them have very different levels of enthusiasm with cooperating with one another. So I think that's why it's important I state up front that this isn't about NATO sort of expanding as an empire. This isn't about NATO looking for an opportunity to military intervene somewhere. This is about NATO recognizing the critical importance of a particular region and finding partners in that region to work together and cooperate with. Now, briefly, I'll just highlight the two main mechanisms that NATO uses in the region, and then I'll talk about briefly the three military interventions that NATO actually has led in North Africa and the Middle East region. And then I'll briefly touch on what can be done to enhance these relationships. So the first one is called the Mediterranean Dialogue, and this was launched in 1994. And this forms the basis of NATO's relations with its Mediterranean partners. And this includes Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Mauritania, Morocco, and Tunisia. Most of the time, this dialogue takes place on a bilateral basis, so like a NATO +1 format. But on occasion, this forum meets as a NATO +7, because there are 7 partner countries in the Mediterranean dialogue. And this is interesting because this would place Israel at the same table with some of its regional neighbors where it would otherwise not be. The other initiative NATO has is called the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, and this was launched in 2004. And this currently forms the basis of NATO's relations with the Gulf states. Although all 6 of the GCC countries were invited to join, only Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE have become participants Saudi Arabia and Oman have expressed some minor interests over the years, but they've done nothing meaningful to join the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. And this goes back to my earlier point. Does this mean that NATO shouldn't engage with Saudi Arabia or Oman? Of course not. But it also means that for whatever reason, the governments are not enthusiastic or willing to get closer to NATO, and that's okay. So NATO should find ways to cooperate with these two countries in a way that makes everyone, comfortable. And over the years, NATO actually has carried out 3 military operations in the North Africa and Middle East region. The first one that occurred was in Iraq between 2004 and 2011, and then more recently, again, and this has been a training operation that helped train Iraqi security forces. In fact, NATO just announced relatively recently, a few months ago, that it's increasing the number of its trainers in Iraq from 500 to about 4,000. So this is a big training operation. This isn't about fighting or defeating Daesh. This is about training the Iraqi security forces. And then between 2009 and 2015, NATO was one of several international missions to combat piracy off the Horn of Africa. And the NATO mission was called Operation Ocean Shield. And then in 2011, of course, NATO enforced the no-fly zone over Libya. NATO called this one Operation Unified Protector. This operation, I should say, tested the political cohesion of NATO. And it, in my opinion, highlighted some of the shortcomings of the alliance, whether it was some NATO countries were literally running out of munitions to drop during the intervention. Some NATO countries didn't allow some of their pilots to fly in certain areas over Libya, which caused problems for the alliance. But also showed opportunities for the alliance because you had some countries, Jordan, the UAE and Qatar, who really stepped up to the plate and worked very closely with NATO during this operation, this no-fly zone operation over Libya. So I'll sum up by looking towards the future briefly here. NATO last published a strategic concept in 2010. Now, a strategic concept is meant to serve as a guide for NATO's leaders to confront and plan for future challenges. Think about what has changed in the world since 2010. A lot. Since 2010, we've had Arab Spring. We've had Russia's invasion of Crimea and Ukraine. We've had the rise of Daesh and then the defeat of Daesh. We've had the Syrian civil war. We've had an emboldened Iran in the region. We've had the emboldened China around the world, including in Europe, and also the pandemic. I mean, so much in the world has changed since 2010. That's why it's good that recently NATO announced that they're going to undertake this laborious process of conducting a new strategic concept. Now, in the last strategic concept, North Africa and the Middle East barely got a mention, and this was a 40-page document. I think if I remember correctly, if you open the document in a PDF and you hit Control F and you search for the words Middle East or North Africa, you might find 1 or 2 passing mentions. You find nothing substantial in the whole document. So one of the first things I think NATO should do is take this opportunity while they conduct a new strategic concept to really focus on how NATO can advance its relationships and interests in Middle East and North Africa regions. Another thing that NATO could do very quickly is appoint a special representative for the MENA region. Especially in this part of the world, these personal relationships are very important. And if NATO appointed a highly respected, experienced diplomat to be NATO's main point of contact for the region, I think that could help with the lines of communication between the countries of the region and NATO. I also think NATO should actively push to enlarge the membership of the Mediterranean Dialogue and Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. While I said that we shouldn't be too pushy. There are cases of some countries that have shown an interest in joining these initiatives, but other countries inside NATO might be blocking their membership. So there's pressure that the US or other countries in NATO could apply internally inside NATO against other members who might be stalling progress on both these two initiatives, the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. And then neither the Mediterranean Dialogue nor the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative has formally met during a NATO summit or a NATO or at the heads of government level. I think it would be fantastic if there was at a NATO summit there was a block of time, like afternoon session or a morning session, that would see the heads of government or the heads of states of the Mediterranean Dialogue countries meeting or the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative countries meeting. I think that would send an important symbol of the importance of these relationships. And finally, NATO needs to seek out opportunities to use both the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative as a way to build confidence between countries in the region. And usually, at least in Western capitals and policymakers think that this means like build confidence between Israel and Arab countries. That's of course a part of it, but there's a lot of underlying tensions and friction at times between certain Arab states. And we saw this in a very public way with the Gulf dispute, but there are also other relationships that behind the scenes are a little more tense. So any opportunity to build confidence between these different countries, I think should be welcome, and perhaps NATO can play a role, albeit it'll be a minor role, but still play a role in doing so. Partnership leads to interoperability, which helps promote.
Sorry, Luke, I'm just going to interrupt you there because you really touch up on so many points that I do want to get back to after.
So I just want to there anyway, so that's perfect. So, perfect. I had like 2 sentences left, so
no, go ahead.
No, it's fine. No problem at all. I was just going to say, the interoperability brings trust, and trust builds relationships, and that will keep us all safer. So that's why we should be focusing on the Middle East and North Africa inside NATO, even though it's not a traditional area for the alliance.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Luke. I do recommend everyone, please do read the report to get really the inside info. Yulia, please, would you be able to give us your comments on the report as well as your own take on what a NATO would look like in the MENA region?
Sure. Thank you, Tarek. And thank you for this initiative. Very timely in the context of what Luke underlined a bit earlier, the NATO strategic review. In that context, a discussion around NATO and MENA is really appropriate, and maybe we can, I think, based on Luke's report, we can really take some valuable insights and push them ahead in terms of cooperation, as he suggested, in the context of willingness on both sides to expand that. Regarding the report itself, congratulations, Luke. I think you addressed some really relevant topics in the context of the NATO strategic review. And in my opinion, the value of this report stems really from 2 major aspects. One is the current assessment of NATO-MENA relations, where they are in terms of cooperation, and then also some of the things that Luke touched upon, and that is the recommendations for the way ahead. In terms of the assessment, to me, the report highlights the newness and the fragility of NATO-MENA relations. Both the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Initiative are also pretty new if you think about how long NATO existed, 1994 and 2004. And we do see a reluctance that Luke highlighted in terms of not everybody participating, For instance, Saudi Arabia and Oman are not part of that initiative. But it is a forum of engagement, both are, and cooperation that also something that Luke highlighted can be expanded into and should be expanded into further cooperation in cases such as Iraq and Libya, where NATO member states already have invested majorly. There's been cooperation on the ground extensively. So I think these are kind of some of the stepping points towards that. And then the other reluctance that is visible in terms of the assessment is the fusion center in Tunisia, where we have the reluctance of the Tunisian government. But on the other side, really, we have, so in terms of institutional engagement, a lot of reluctance, I would argue, actually from both sides, some Arab and Middle Eastern states, as well as NATO. But I think when it comes to engagement on the ground and interest, Luke is correct in pointing out that the right structure for dialogue is needed, like one or two or more personal contacts to be able to engage from the NATO side in building really confidence on both sides in terms of cooperation. And then we do see ample cooperation on the ground, which is really the most efficient thing to assess. So we have kind of institutional reluctance, but on the ground, we have some really valuable lessons learned. I think the first one is Kosovo, that's in Europe, where we had significant participation from UAE and Morocco. That's already in the late 90s. Then a couple of years later in Afghanistan, so already a different continent, we have amazing contributions from Bahrain and Jordan and the UAE. The Iraqi training mission that we mentioned was extended and also shows the willingness from the Iraqi government to engage more because of the value that NATO can bring in terms of training, etc. We have the NATO Operation Shield mission, where this is again another region where we have complex cooperation from both sides. And then finally, what also Luke touched upon, Libya, where Jordan, Qatar, and UAE provided valuable support in terms of military capabilities and really saved some of the Europeans in terms of coordinating on the ground. So really, to sum up, I think our main starting points for enhanced NATO-MENA cooperation are that cooperation is new and fragile in terms of political willingness on both sides, but that the cooperation in theaters in Europe, in Afghanistan, in the Middle East is pretty efficient, and that we do not have yet the right instruments for bilateral cooperation in place, and a lot more can be done in terms of what can be on the agenda of the new NATO summit. And then just to take the conversation a little bit more into what has been done and can be done, there's a lot of things that we can touch upon, including the NATO Parliamentary Assembly that has been doing also some progress on the Middle East special group in cooperation there. Bilateral agreements, which in my opinion are some of the key to engage with individual MENA countries from the side of NATO, and we already have, in terms of these bilateral agreements, joint exercises in maritime security, in counter-piracy, in non-proliferation, and even in energy security. So just to wrap up the conversation in terms of the report, I think the next steps would be to analyze kind of what is on the ground already in terms of contributions, what is NATO actually doing right now in the Middle East. For instance, the AWACS operation for many years in Turkey that aids the coalition in Syria, or has until recently. We have the NATO response force for humanitarian assistance that we can go to, that has done already some amazing work and can aid further in cooperation. And then there's a lot of issues, I think, to discuss in terms of something that Luke alluded to a bit earlier, reluctance or willingness from individual NATO member states and their visions when it comes to the MENA, with different actors and with a lot of shared, increasingly global and shared areas of cooperation and of threat assessment that really show that it's not necessarily valid anymore to artificially separate the issues that Europe or the transatlantic community address with the issues that NATO, that MENA region countries are to address. And I think there's a lot of common ground there in terms of identifying common issues and in developing them into tiered cooperation on specific issues.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your comments. I want to start off, Luke. I wanted to ask you, now you've spoken about how when you go through the 2010 NATO document and search for the term Middle East or North Africa, it barely pops up. Now, really, why has NATO done so little to enhance this relationship with the MENA region since 2010?
Well, as Julia said, practically speaking, there has been a considerable amount of cooperation, not in a formal sense. You know, you haven't seen any great strategic declarations made by NATO about the importance of North Africa and the Middle East, but you have seen like practical things happening on the ground in terms of training and cooperation and whatnot. So that's good. And Julia also mentioned a very important point, which I didn't highlight, which is the bilateral relationships that NATO members have with certain countries in the region. And NATO's relationships with the Middle East and North Africa regions will be paved on the road built by these bilateral relationships, whether it's, you know, the UK and Oman or Bahrain, or the US and Bahrain, or France and the UAE. You know, you have a lot of key, and that's just a few. I don't want to leave any key relationships out, but you have a lot of important relationships by NATO members that are, it's outside the NATO framework, but as being part of NATO, it still impacts the alliance. So I think that in 2010, I was involved actually when we had this whole debate inside NATO about publishing this document. And I remember it was very much meant to be this document that's going to touch on all the cool new threats around the world, right? It's like, you know, energy and cyber, and this was what it was billed as, you know. And really at the time of 2010, these weren't even new threats. These were like everyday threats. So NATO was trying to keep up. And it's been a decade now, more than a decade, since we've had this review. So the reason why I don't think the Middle East and North Africa got a lot of attention in 2010 during the development of this was the memory of Iraq was still in everyone's minds. Many members in NATO still thought that, you know, the Middle East is still America's problem. We don't want the alliance anywhere near it. This was 2 years after Russia invaded Georgia, so there was some focus on Russia at the time, not as much as there probably should have been, but there was some. But it was the whole cyber warfare, energy, you know, disinformation was even started to be talked about. That, so I think that's why. I think there was just there was a reluctance to look at how more traditional threats and opportunities exist around Europe. And that's why there's a failure to really address the Middle East and North Africa regions.
And if I may just piggyback on that and add one thing for us to consider in terms, Luke, you kind of earlier listed everything that happened between 2010 and 2020 now. The other thing that I think we need to consider in terms of bilateral and NATO member states willing to be more engaged, based on Tariq's question, is one big event, and that is the 2015 migration crisis. I think that has put for European NATO member states much more the MENA region on the map, really forced to put it on the map. So I think now with 2020, though we have a lot more focus on Russia and China, there has to be more place and more willingness to consider further cooperation between NATO on one side and or EU, but in this case NATO and MENA countries, because European countries, I guess, do not feel the same as they did in 2010 when Middle East was just an American problem, and I think to a certain extent they still do, because there's just not that much willingness on the side of all member states. But if you look at countries like major powers like Germany and France, and the issues that we have in Europe in terms of how we perceive migration, refugees, and how we engage with the South from the European side, this will add further on the agenda, I'm hoping, for the NATO strategic review in terms of how much Europeans are willing to engage with the region further.
Thank you, Julia. Speaking of which, we've seen a lot of tension even within NATO member states within the region. So we've seen the whole Libya debacle with France and Turkey coming head to head. Can you build up on that? Would that have any changes on what's to come with how NATO deals with the region? Because you have certain areas where NATO really does have to take a stance. So what does it do when it comes to such a position?
Well, it's been complicated over the last few months, let's say specifically to Libya, and I think that kind of builds on the issue that we have with Europeans being more and more forced to engage. But we know that it's been difficult, especially in the context of Libya, because we have the head-to-head conflicts and difference of perceptions between, for instance, Turkey, who is a key NATO member state, especially connecting it to the MENA region, and France. France has always been traditionally engaged south. It's our European country that is engaging south. We know that France itself has a complicated relationship with NATO, with partial withdrawal and then coming back. With all these things in mind, I think the strategic review, when it comes to engaging specifically on cases like Libya, will remain vague because it's too many member states and because it's too many conflicting interests. But I think the Turkey aspect in general also leads us to another issue that we share more and more. So one is the migration issue around it and how we deal, how we need to cooperate with MENA countries in terms of the Sahel and migration from there, and change our ways of working. But the other thing is Russia itself, and I think here there is need for more willingness or more assessment from several MENA countries in terms of what does Russia mean in the Middle East. We know that from the NATO perspective, we focused artificially on just Eastern Europe, especially after Ukraine. But we know that after 2014 Ukraine, Russia intervened in Syria. We know that with Frontier Europe, we're looking at the Black Sea as a region in which Asia, Europe, and the Middle East meet. And we know that Russia is projecting, using the militarization of that region that is already part of the Middle East, if you think about it, geographically pushing, militarizing that region to project power south into the Mediterranean. And we've seen that in 2015 with Syria, and now we see it increasingly with Libya. And there are potential other discussions here that will in other countries and issues where Russia is getting more active. So even among European NATO member states, we have over the last 10 years an issue in admitting or analyzing, making an assessment of what Russia means. And usually we know from history that wherever Russia goes, there's trouble. And so these two regions, Southeast Europe and the Middle East, are increasingly connected through that issue. If we find a way within the context of the NATO strategic report or a different one to create cooperation and dialogue on both sides, we might be able to put Russia in a frame that is at least a challenge, if not a threat, to both regions in terms of power. So that's one of the things that I think is the most important and most complicated issue when it comes to an assessment of MENA and Europe, the transatlantic space in terms of common threat assessment, really.
Thank you. Luke, I wanted to ask you, you said you were a traditionalist at the beginning of this conversation. Now, that being said, NATO in its essence began as countering the rise in Russia's the Soviet Union's take in Europe. So given that both Russia and China do have interests at stake in the Middle East region, will that, and they are cooperating on both energy, on health, on a number of issues. Will that stand as an obstacle to NATO building closer ties to Middle Eastern countries? That's one. And two, will NATO even look to establish its own as you said, it's a diplomat within the Middle East region, or would it be better for the Middle East region to create this offshoot NATO to have over there? This also goes to Yulia after Luke.
Yeah, well, the Middle East NATO debate about, I think it's called MESA, the Middle East Stability Alliance. The Trump initiative. We could have a whole conference about this topic. So I'll answer that in a second. But first, on the point about Russia and NATO, and China in the Middle East. Firstly, we have to remember that NATO is very limited in terms of its policy competencies, right? This is an intergovernmental security alliance that is built around the idea of a collective defense. If one country in the alliance is attacked, then everyone is attacked. But there's actually a caveat to that as well, because as I said in Article 6, it says the collective security guarantee only applies to territory in the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer. So for example, if North Korea shot missiles at Hawaii today, that wouldn't cause a NATO crisis, right? NATO wouldn't be expected to come fight a war against North Korea because Hawaii is in the Pacific. It's not in the North Atlantic area. So of course, China and Russia are competing against members of NATO in the Middle East in terms of economic activity, energy cooperation, this and that. But there's no, I would say, direct security threats coming directly at a NATO member from China or Russia in the Middle East. So I wouldn't be supportive of NATO trying to, in some sort of military or security fashion, countering Russian aggression in another region of the world. I think NATO needs to be aware that Russia might be active in another region of the world, but I don't think we should bring a war against Russia to another region of the world, especially when NATO's treaty is very clear that it's the North Atlantic, area north of the Tropic of Cancer. But there's more to the alliance, or there's more to Europe and North America than just NATO. You have a lot of multilateral, bilateral cooperation in the region with NATO members and Middle East countries, which we've already discussed. So I think that's probably, in terms of the economic aspects, the energy aspects, this is probably best done outside of NATO. Otherwise, we start asking for NATO to do things that it was never meant to do, and it doesn't do them because it can't, and then we get disappointed. Like terrorism is a good example. President Trump was saying that NATO needs to be a new counterterrorism force. Well, NATO could be a tool in the toolbox to fight terrorism, but it can't be the toolbox itself. I mean, to fight terrorism effectively, you need policy competency over terrorist financing. You need controls over immigration and border security. You need a law enforcement capability. You need an intelligence gathering and sharing capability. You need a de-radicalization program. These are things that NATO as an intergovernmental security organization lacks the policy competencies to do. It doesn't have a parliament. They can't enact legislation to stop terrorist financing. It can't do any of this stuff, right? So that's why I'm always very cautious when we say NATO should do certain things that it's not equipped nor designed to do. On the point about a Middle East NATO, the conditions that allowed for the creation of NATO during the aftermath of World War II are unique, and we don't see them today in the Middle East. I've been a supporter of this idea of a MESA, the Middle East Stability Agreement, I think it is, and but I think that even that itself has to go beyond security. I think that the US should lead an initiative in the region to get like-minded countries together to cooperate more deeply on security issues, but also on economic free trade. And this starts at home in the US too. I mean, we have a few free trade agreements with countries in the Middle East. Oman's one of them, Bahrain is another, forgetting a couple, I'm sure. But, we still have these ridiculous aluminum or aluminium, depending on which version of English you speak. My wife's British, so I understand both. These aluminum tariffs, these steel tariffs that we have against some of our partners in the Middle East, which has impacted, which this industry served as a key part of the U.S. free trade agreement with Oman, for example. But yet now we apply these tariffs and it only disproportionately hurts our partners in the region. So we need a security aspect of it. We need a trade aspect. We need economic cooperation in the region as well. And then maybe someday if this initiative becomes more permanent or institutionalized, then that could be an interlocutor with NATO. But I don't see right now, the need or really the willingness or the ability to create like a NATO in the Middle East.
Thank you, Luke. Yulia, care to take this on?
Sure. I mean, I think here I differ a little bit from Luke partially, though I think we're both solidly hawks when it comes to traditional NATO challenges. But then on the other side, you do see NATO with the attempt in 2010 with the strategic concept, then to, as Luke suggested, get into these new modern threats and expand kind of the region of responsibility. And so if we look at what NATO is doing right now and what it can do, maybe when it comes to MENA, it makes sense to think about wider areas of cooperation that are not necessarily the stricter military intervention or military cooperation. One thing that for instance, I think is an interesting case of what NATO has been doing in the region in the traditional sense is the mission of AWACS aircraft. These are the ones that are monitoring the sky with a UFO on top, that have been operating only on Turkish territory. They're NATO capabilities, one of the few, if not the only, really collective capabilities that we have, that have really supported in terms of air monitoring, air surveillance, situational awareness, and more recently, airspace management. The work of the US-led global coalition to defeat ISIS. So we do have, this is more of a conventional example, but we do have NATO support in the region that is not, it's not military intervention. They don't have, they don't shoot or anything. They just monitor and help. And that helps the MENA region as well. The other kind of non-conventional thing that I think is very interesting, and where NATO has proven even recently a lot of non-conventional capacity to help out and to build cooperation, is just humanitarian assistance through the response force, where NATO has helped in the Katrina hurricane in 2005, in 2006 in Pakistan, with the earthquake in 2014. We had NATO members providing aid, helicopters, everything in Bosnia, and then most recently during COVID, we had a massive mobilization of NATO to help in the early days, airlifting, bringing equipment needed for early response to COVID all over Europe, from one place to another, which has shown that actually NATO and not EU, interestingly, have been able to move fast on these issues. And this is also, I think, an area that we can consider in terms of disaster management, logistical engagement, that is not traditional NATO, but can help. And I think there's willingness also from the MENA side. We've seen it over the last few years to enhance that kind of non-conventional cooperation, to be able to help in the long term, also with challenges and threats that affect NATO territory, even though it's not necessarily direct. In terms of the looking ahead, that the response force is something that that we can consider if you look at natural disasters over the last few months. Even in the MENA region, we have interoperability, fantastic one, with some MENA region countries, or specifically Gulf countries, and then we also have just a set of shared security issues when it comes to building cooperation that is not necessarily conventional NATO military. Irregular migration from the Sahel, I mentioned, terrorism, that whether we like it or not, NATO has been doing a lot to support counterterrorism in the region. Russia, I mentioned. China, Luke mentioned, as an increasing presence. And then also resume discussions in the context of COVID between Middle East countries and Iran. That's probably going to become an issue as well, that should be discussed between NATO and MENA countries. And so there's, I think, because of the reluctance going back, especially from MENA countries, but also from NATO to engage, I think a way to go ahead and build that cooperation is to think a little bit out of the box. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, create tiered cooperation on certain issues that are not necessarily branded as just military NATO.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much for your comments. I'm going to take one question from the audience that will start off with Luke, and then Yulia, you can answer that afterwards. This is from Morius Rotaru. He says, hello, thank you for the excellent discussion. I agree, it is an excellent discussion. How do you think Turkey's cooperation with Russia in Syria and with Iran in Iraq influences NATO actions in the Middle East? Before you answer, everyone who has a question, please do write it out in the Q&A. We will not be letting people speak so that we have enough time to get as many questions as possible. Thanks.
Right. I hear this often, and to be honest, I'm actually puzzled on this narrative that somehow Turkey and Russia are geopolitically aligned. I don't actually see this. I see a good relationship between President Erdogan and President Putin. But once geopolitical interests converge, then I quickly see a division between NATO and Russia. Firstly, we should not forget that I said NATO and Russia, I meant Turkey and Russia. We shouldn't forget that the natural state of affairs for Turkey and Russia is to be one of competition, of sometimes conflict, sometimes hostility. Since the 1500s, the two powers have fought 12 major wars against each other, and many of them were over Crimea alone, and many smaller wars dispersed in between. While we saw Turkey purchase the S-400 system from Russia, we have seen a Turkey that has pushed back on Russia in the South Caucasus through the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We see Turkey pushing back against Russia in Libya. Also, I don't think there's much cooperation between Russia and Turkey at all in Syria. If you look at what Turkey's doing in Idlib, protecting the civilians that have converged onto Idlib in the face of Assad and Russian attacks. And then you have, for example, Ukraine, where Turkey has been a big supporter, vocal supporter of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and has just signed a massive defense deal with Ukraine to provide some of these same very effective drones that we have seen in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Syria, in Libya, to the Ukrainians. And Turkey is one of the most vocal supporters of Georgia joining NATO. Again, this is another example of not really going along with the Russian position or the Russian narrative. So I think President Erdogan is very pragmatic, and I think I think the S-400 deal with Russia was part of a bigger, complex geopolitical web that meant sticking America in its eye over our unwillingness to sell them Patriot. And then you have the F-35 program that Turkey was removed from. You have all these different things, but at the end of the day, unless we're going to go against about 500 years of history, we should assume that the natural state of affairs between Turkey and Russia is one of competition, if not conflict. And on Iran, I don't necessarily see much Turkish-Iranian cooperation. Where there was cooperation, it was on energy. And last year, 2020, saw a reduction of 1/3 of Turkey's Iranian gas imports compared to 2019. And this shortfall was actually made up by an increased LNG imports from Qatar and the United States. In fact, in the US LNG to Turkey increased 130% from the previous year in 2020. Any country that borders Iran, for the most part, is going to have, take a pragmatic approach to its relationships with Tehran, just for the sake of geography. I don't see any overt willingness by Turkey to cooperate with Iran and to undermine NATO or the United States.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Luke on this. I would just re-emphasize the historical perspective and that there is natural competition, if not more than that, in a negative sense between Turkey and Russia. I think the problem that we have in the context of NATO-MENA cooperation and generally the role of Turkey is more a specific problem of Erdogan's anti-Americanism that he's fueling at home, which really disables him to build further cooperation with the West against Russia. And I would argue that specifically there's been complications between the two in the Black Sea region that I'm focused on, mostly because Turkey has had a general policy, also hundreds of years old, that they want to have the West staying out because of anti-Americanism, but they realized a little bit too late, or they're hopefully in the process of realizing in Ankara that Russia is even competing and limiting its power in the Black Sea. And the other thing that I want to piggyback also or underline what Luke said in terms of the Turkish relationship with Russia is that it's unpredictable, and in the long run we do not know what the priorities are of Putin or Erdogan, but we do see that Turkey, in the context of what Luke was highlighting very correctly with LNG, Turkey has been pushing over the last few years, first to become an energy hub for the region, and then to become energetically independent. That's why we see so much aggressive action in the Eastern Med, and increasingly more presence in the Black Sea, because there's new resources there as well. So I think this trend of Turkey becoming more independent energetically, which empowers it to become overall more powerful, will balance the relations that it has with Iran, that they're on the downturn, will balance the relations with Russia because they're on the downturn, and we might see with Turkey realizing that Russia is more of a threat than a competition to them at this moment, that that relations will go down, and maybe there will be, with a lot of push from countries around it like Georgia, Ukraine, Romania, and others, to push to be able to have Turkey on a more Western path, more against Russia, and more against more opposition towards Iran's expansion. That's kind of the positive view of it. It can go either way, but I think over the last few months and years, we do see, putting anti-Americanism to the side, we do see encouraging signs from the Turkish government that they're reassessing their strategic understanding of Russia, of Iran, and the whole region. And that, with the final point only, is another example how the MENA region and Europe are, or the transatlantic community, are becoming increasingly intertwined with global challenges, and increasingly strategically complex, because we have to look out for the Turkish position, the French position, relations between the United States that are evolving with Arab countries. That's something that Luke, I think, highlighted very well in the report, if only briefly, that a lot is dependent also in this relationship, Natomina, on the United States as a leader of NATO, really. But I think overall we do see encouraging signs that that Turkey will not continue on many issues, not on all, to push for Russia and for Iran and against the West.
Thank you. And our last question was from Magda Faraday Stupples. Since not all NATO members pay their full financial subscription, who would finance an extension of NATO's work in the MENA countries?
Yeah,
Luke,
without a doubt, NATO countries haven't been meeting their 2% benchmark, 2% of GDP on national defense. That's the goal. But it's a little different from their financial obligations to the alliance itself, right? So NATO has a funding mechanism called costs lie where they fall, right? So if a country wants to do a big training exercise, then it gets together with other countries inside NATO and they cover the cost, right? NATO has some common funding, which is designed to like literally pay for the electricity for the NATO headquarters building, to pay for the cleaning staff, to pay for the IT equipment, whatnot. And that makes up a very small percentage of what NATO as an alliance spends money on. And each country is required to send a certain amount of money to NATO for this common funding to keep the headquarters running. And no country has failed to pay this. So technically speaking, every country has met their subscription fees, so to speak, for NATO. But in terms of a member's commitment to fund their armed forces, there has been a shortfall, without a doubt. But there is a distinction there that is worth pointing out. If NATO wants to hold new training exercises in the region, I think it depends on where we're talking about. If it's in Mauritania, then the countries inside NATO that have a geopolitical interest there will have to probably help pay to have that carried out like they would with any other major NATO training exercise. If we're talking about a military exercise in the Gulf, well, this isn't a region that's really in need of charity. So then I'm sure NATO all sides will be benefiting from this. So I'm sure NATO could work out some sort of way to make sure that the costs are shared among all participants, even those from the region. So that's it's a good question, because you have to pay for these things, but it's not quite as simple as not all NATO members are paying. That issue is very complex in itself.
Yulia, do you have anything to add to that?
Really very little in terms of, yes, underpayment is an all problem. It dates back not 2 years, but a few decades, and Americans have been voicing that for decades too, with Europeans being slow to respond. We do see now, especially under the Trump administration, a boost of that. But we also see a lot of discussions in terms of how efficient these 2% are, and how much you invest, if 2% is enough, if it shouldn't be 3%, how much of that money is invested into research and development. And that says a lot in terms of how much indeed NATO member states can put up when it comes to expanding. But I would argue that the mere calculation of their defense contributions and investments to into the military sphere are not as connected to what can be done with MENA. I think our takeaways from here, from our conversation, is that something that really Luke started with, it's not about a new intervention unless there's a major crisis that we do not see now. It's a matter of increasing cooperation through people-to-people contacts, through more presence of MENA countries in the NATO discussions. When it comes to examples like the Tunisia Center, I think the money is there. I think it's more the willingness of both sides to enhance that cooperation. Unless we're talking about a major military intervention, and then it's not, and we don't. But if we would, then it's not, I think, about the money, but rather the political willingness to intervene. And there I would say that from that side, at least Europeans we've seen it around Syria discussions in the early days, that Europeans are just not willing and able. They don't have the resources to even defend their own territory in Europe. So I don't think they have the willingness to put up a lot of equipment and money invested into MENA. And I'm not sure that MENA countries, as Luke suggested, need that necessarily when it comes to the military aspect, but rather when it comes to cooperation on interoperability, exercises, and training centers. So maybe it's not just the money, it's also the political willingness.
Thank you both very much. Now, I know we are 5 minutes now above end time, but if you would briefly like to give your closing comments before we wrap up this really interesting and crucial debate.
Just that I hope more NATO policymakers see how the Middle East, North Africa, and European geopolitical interests converge. And if you if you go to U.S. or most European offices and you see a map of Europe, you see the Black Sea in the lower right-hand corner. If you put the Black Sea, which I believe is like the geopolitical center of Europe when it comes to the challenges it faces, if you place that sea in the middle of the map, then you start, I think, to get a better picture of the geopolitical challenges that Europe and NATO faces. This is why I think we need to have closer cooperation with Middle East and North Africa.
And for me, very briefly, I think the main takeaways are that NATO can do more, and MENA cooperation in MENA cooperation, that it's a matter of willingness on both sides, but that we can take what we have already to talk about enhanced dialogue with existing partners, exploring new partnership opportunities to address common security challenges, whatever they are that we agree on. They don't have to be all of them, they just can be some. Yes, to underline what Luke said, because Luke and I work on the same issue. Yes, if you place the Black Sea on the map in the center, and you look at there's a with the apology of self-advertising, there's a video of a panel discussion that I did for Georgetown when I looked at military as well as energy capabilities developing in the whole region, Black Sea, South Caucasus, and the Eastern Med, which shows how interconnected these regions are becoming, all the way from Tunisia and Israel to the South Caucasus and Europe's east. And if we think about these issues in more global terms, then I think we can reassess NATO's cooperation and with MENA in different terms.
And with that, thank you both very, very much. For everyone who wants to re-watch this very engaging debate and discussion, please do visit Arab News Research and Studies Unit, where you'll find the recording once it's up. Again, I really do want to thank our brilliant panelists for today, as well as the Frontier Europe Initiative at the Middle East Institute for its brilliant partnership. Thank you both, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.